Good evening, and once again, welcome. This lesson is being recorded for Sunday, November the 14th, 2021. This is the second lesson of the day, the lesson that will be presented when we assemble together at 6 o'clock. And again, I invite you to come be with us if you are in the Bellflower area. And in the meantime, we will just continue to share these lessons online as well. This evening, we are going to be continuing our study of the subject of premillennialism, a lesson that, or a series that we began about a month ago. We've actually taken a break for a couple of weeks, and we are going to resume our study today over the course of the next 2 or 3 weeks in this particular study here. Now, just to remind you of what we've dealt with in times past, in our last lesson, we began to examine the Great Tribulation by examining the text of Daniel chapter 9. And today we're going to continue to deal with the Great Tribulation by examining Matthew chapter 24. So I ask you to turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 24 for our lesson for this evening. Now, bear in mind, when we talk about premillennialism, what we are talking about is a doctrine that teaches that we are living in the time period prior to the Lord's return, in which he will establish a millennial reign, that is a 1,000-year reign on this earth. And thus far in our study, we've talked about the rapture and noted how while saints are going to be caught up in the air to be with the Lord, there is no indication that once they do that there is going to be another return afterwards. And then in our last lesson, we started talking about the tribulation, which is supposed to be a period of 7 years. And that was based on Daniel chapter 9 that we examined in our last lesson. That's what we're going to continue to deal with in our lesson this evening. Of course, following this period of tribulation, the Lord's supposed to return with his saints, and that's when a number of events are going to happen, as recorded in Revelation. The Battle of Armageddon, the kingdom is going to be established. Jews will return to Jerusalem, and then Jesus will begin his reign in Jerusalem on the physical throne of David in Jerusalem for 1,000 years. Following that, there will be the final judgment. The wicked will be condemned to hell, and the righteous will be rewarded with eternity in heaven. And so that's the premise of the premillennial theory, what most people believe concerning this particular theory. Now, as I said, in our last lesson, we dealt with what is described as the Great Tribulation. And that's basically a reference to a period of time about 7 years after the rapture of the saints, both the dead and the living, and that's what the predominant view is. And it is a time of judgment on the earth, which includes disasters, plagues, economic turmoil, wars, and all type of upheaval. Just everything that is bad that you can think of happening is happening in intense degrees on the world. And according to the book of Revelation, these are a judgment of God. Now, about halfway through this 7-year period of tribulation, the Great Tribulation will begin, and that's a reference to the persecution of Christians. And what happens is supposedly during this tribulation, the Antichrist will arise, and he will basically rule the world, and eventually he will outlaw true worship, and he will begin to persecute saints, both Jew and Christian alike. And this persecution will be more severe than anything that has happened in history. And they estimate that it'll last for a period of about 3.5 years, after which time the Lord will return. Now, passages that are used to support this, Daniel chapter 9, which we talked about, as I said, in our last lesson. And this is where they get the idea of the 7 years, and it's based on the 70-week prophecy of Daniel chapter 9. With the 7th week being when Christ comes to this earth, and halfway through Messiah is cut off, and they teach the idea of a parenthetical time frame, which is the church age, and it's going to be resumed a little later on. But also they turn to Revelation 6 through 18, and they basically point out that chapter 7 and verse 14 talks about the Great Tribulation. And the martyred saints who will not suffer in the Great Tribulation. But they also observe in Revelation 6 through 18 that since there's no mention of the church in those chapters, that the church has already been raptured up. So that's some of what we find in this particular theory. And as I pointed out last time, we dealt with Daniel chapter 9, and we pointed that we noted that it was pointing toward the destruction of Jerusalem. But that brings us to Matthew 24, the text that I want us to examine today. Again, this is another text that is misunderstood by many. And premillennialism believes that this text is descriptive of the end times. And while there are some who would attribute this text to the destruction of Jerusalem, but they would also say that it has a dual meaning attached to it. That is, that while physically it may have applied to Jerusalem, there are things in there that are pointing toward the end of time, or when the Lord does return and rapture his saints, and the tribulation that is going to happen after that. They basically say that hasn't happened yet, those types of things. But I'm going to try in this lesson today to show that everything in Matthew chapter 24, at least up through verse number 35, and some actually make the case that the entire chapter of Matthew 24 is dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem, and it's directed exclusively toward the destruction of Jerusalem. There's nothing in that text to indicate that those verses are dealing with anything other than the destruction of Jerusalem. And we'll see why here as we go through this particular text. And I guess I'd clarify in that the destruction of Jerusalem and events that led up to the destruction of Jerusalem. And that becomes important to understand. Now, what we're going to see is that this text is relatively clear about its intended fulfillment. I want you to note that as you look at the background leading up to this, you have Matthew 23, which I've actually preached a couple of lessons on that recently on Sunday morning, dealing with our theme for the year, which is the teachings of Jesus. And we talked about how this was likely the final public teaching or preaching of Jesus. And it was a scathing rebuke of the corrupt religious leaders. And I believe that this was the straw that broke the camel's back, that caused them to move immediately rather than to wait after the Passover feast to execute Jesus. They wanted to get rid of him, and they wanted to get rid of him now. And of course, when you read other events leading up to this, you find that Jesus has cleansed the temple, likely for a second time. He has presented these parables about rejection, and we're told that they clearly understood that he was talking about them, the religious leaders, that is. And then you have this scathing rebuke in Matthew 23. And at the conclusion of Matthew 23, in verse 37, you read there, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets, stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And the point is made that your house has left you desolate. Jesus is grieving over corrupt Israel, the corrupt religious leaders who, for all intents and purposes, have once again rejected God. And when they crucify the Lord, it's going to be a final rejection. And thus their house is going to be left desolate. And that brings us to Matthew chapter 24. And so let's go ahead and start. And we're going to read through this text and make observations as we go through the text, seeing what it is likely talking about, as well as concerning some of the details associated with it. So beginning in chapter 24 and in verse 1, we read there, "Then," so that points back to what we just talked about, "Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up and showed him the buildings of the temple." So here we find that his disciples are there, and they're showing him the temple complex and various buildings that are associated with it. how beautiful it was, and various things that were going on. And as I understand, Herod was even in, Herod the Great had established a building project that wasn't completed at this time and would not be completed till the mid-60s. So it was a grand project of rebuilding or restoring the temple. And as such, the disciples were showing Jesus this structure. And Jesus in verse 20 or verse 2 said to them, "Do you not see all these? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon her or upon another that shall not be thrown down." So Jesus declares, you see these buildings? I want to tell you right now, the day is coming when not a stone is going to be left upon another. This complete temple is going to be totally wiped out and destroyed, is what Jesus said to them on that occasion. And then we find a little bit later, after this, he sat on the Mount of Olives. So Jesus leaves the temple, goes to the Mount of Olives. His disciples are with him, and it says they came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So we find that the disciples, they've heard Jesus say it's going to be destroyed. And so the disciples say, when are these things going to take place? And they ask either 2 or 3 questions. The reason I say that is, they say, when will these things be? When is this going to happen, number 1? And number 2, what is going to be the sign of your coming, that is for the destruction of these things and for the end of the age? So when are these things going to happen? How are we going to know when they're going to happen? And how are we going to know when the end comes? And the last 2 could have actually been tied together in one, as you find it actually addressed in this particular text. So that's a little bit of the background of what we are dealing with. And that leads Jesus to basically tell them a little bit about what was leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, I want to begin by actually going to the end of this discussion, or the end of this text, by going to verse 34. Matthew 24 and verses 34 and 35. And what I want you to notice here is it says, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away." I want you to notice here that Jesus says, "I say to you that this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place." So Jesus is basically saying very straightforward that these events that he had just talked about, they were going to occur during that generation. Now, premillennialists will say that the idea of a generation here refers to the Jewish people. And they make the observation that since Jewish people are still around, that generation has not gone away. They might use an argument similar to the way that we would say that we're living in the last days, and we have been in the last days, since the church was established. This is the final dispensation, if you will. And they use it that way to refer to the Jewish people. However, that's not the common usage of this particular word. Typically, it refers to a lifespan of somewhere between 30 and 40 years. What we would think of as a generation, from one generation to the next. People might live 20, 25 years and have children, and they begin the next generation as they grow up and begin to, go their own way and basically begin to live life. That's your next generation. And that's very much what you find definitions concerning what a generation is. And you can look up either Thayer or Vines, both of those dictionaries of New Testament words, and they will give you that as a primary description of this word, generation. Now, I want you to note that this word is used in a number of other places, and let me just give you a couple of examples of it. Over in Mark chapter 8 and in verse number 12, Mark chapter 8 and in verse number 12, you find there the Pharisees come asking for a sign. And Jesus sighs and says, why does this generation seek a sign? Or over in Luke chapter 11 and in verse number 50. Luke chapter 11 and in verse number 50, Jesus says, verse 49, the wisdom of God also said, I will send them prophets, apostles. Some of them they will kill and persecute, that the blood of all the prophets which was shed from the foundation of the world may be required of this generation. The blood of the prophets is going to be required of this generation is the emphasis of that particular text. So we see in these texts, and you could add others to them, Luke 17:25 talks about the Son of Man will be rejected by this generation. You know, clearly it's talking about a lifespan that is there, 30 to 40 years. And if you calculate from the time of the crucifixion of Jesus to the destruction of Jerusalem, you're talking somewhere around 40 years. So it would fit the definition of this generation if that was the case. But there's some other considerations to think about. When you go back to our text, you'll find there in verse number 33, Jesus says to his disciples, so you also, when you see these things, know that it is near at the door. He's saying you're going to see, some of you are going to see these things. Some of you who are with me are going to witness these things. And that brings another observation to mind to give consideration as you go all throughout Matthew chapter 24. And I want you to notice this as we read through the text here. Notice how often the expression you is used. It's the audience to whom Jesus is speaking. And of course, realize that in verse number 3, as we noted a few moments ago, it was his disciples that came to him and said, tell us when these things will be. And what is the signs? What is the sign of these things? And the sign of your coming and so on. And Jesus all throughout is going to use this expression, you. Verse 4, take heed that no one deceives you. Verse 9, they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. And you can just go on and on throughout the chapter. And over you will see that expression pointing to the fact that Jesus was talking to them and saying, these are things that you are going to witness. And I would say some of you, because some of them obviously would die before the actual destruction takes place. But he's making the point, you're going to witness these things. Now, with that as a backdrop, looking at verse number 34 and understand that Jesus says this generation, let's keep that in mind as we try to give application to the various things that are said throughout this chapter. Beginning in verse number 4, which we read a moment ago, Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceive you. So this is a warning to the disciples. Don't let anybody fool you about anything else. And he goes on in verse number 5 and says, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. So the first warning that Jesus gives is there are many people who are going to come along, and they're going to say that they are the Savior. They're going to say that they are the Messiah that people were looking for, the Christ, the Anointed One. And you have example of people that thought that they were someone greater, deceived the people. You have the example of Theudas. And one thing that is interesting about Theudas, and Josephus, in one of his works, which is referred to as the War of the Jews, and that's actually a book in which Josephus retells the history of some of the persecutions of the Jews, and he devotes quite a bit of time to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, which he witnessed. And so he writes details concerning the destruction. And don't you think for a moment that Josephus was a Christian. He was not. He was a Jewish historian. Someone who, in reality, would have been hostile to the faith. He mentions Theudas in War of the Jews. And another example that I think of is Simon, in Acts chapter 8 and verse 8, where Philip goes to the city of Samaria and he finds Simon, this magician there, who's deceiving the people who think he's somebody who's great. And the point is you have a couple of examples, and there could have been many others, individuals who got it in their own mind that they were the deliverer, or they would deceive people into thinking that they were the deliverer that they were looking for. So Jesus says there's going to be people coming along saying they're the Christ, and Jesus says you don't believe them. Don't believe who they are. Well, you go on in verses 6 and 7, after Jesus says that he goes on and says, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilence, earthquake in various places. All these things are the beginning of sorrows. So Jesus says you're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. Now, an interesting observation to make. During the time that Jesus was on earth, as I understand, there was relative peace throughout the Roman Empire. But that wasn't going to last. There were going to be all different types of wars. And again, history records that. And especially in the decade or so prior to Jerusalem's fall, there are a number of wars that are documented by historians such as Josephus, and you've got Tacitus and others who recorded many of these historical events. So you find that it was a time of upheaval throughout the empire. And there were rebellions that were arising, and I'm going to tell you right now that amongst these rebellions were the Jews. Or at least some of them. Remember we've talked about the sect of the Jews, the Zealots? Well, they were opposed to Rome, and it is actually said that in about the 60s or so on that they gained more influence and more power, and they started to rebel against the Roman Empire. The temple was almost reaching its completion, and so on. And so you have a great deal of rebellion amongst the Zealots, and they even caused trouble to some of the traditional religious leaders, as we'll see a little bit more in this particular lesson. So you had rumors of wars and upheaval. And then Jesus makes the point the end is not yet. And I believe here he's talking about the end of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem. And he was basically saying that all these things are going to occur before the prophesied destruction, where not one stone was going to be left upon another. And he goes on later on in verse 7, and he says you're going to hear of famines and pestilence. Again, those things have been recorded. Historically, there's records of numerous famines and pestilence. Acts 11:27 talks about a famine in the whole world that Agabus prophesied about. Now, I realize this is earlier, but the point is there were famines going on from time to time. So this would be something that would have occurred back then, and I would venture to say during the majority of history. These descriptions could apply to any time frame. But apparently there were some things that were probably specifically associated with Judah at that time, things that they would deal with. And incidentally, in Acts chapter 11, the famine was in Judea as well as throughout the world. Acts 24:7 records earthquakes. Again, the history records record earthquakes in numerous places, including Asia Minor, that actually wiped out cities. And there was even earthquakes in Judea. So there's historical documentation for those things happening prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jesus goes on in verse number 8, and he says, all these things are the beginning of sorrows. This isn't the end of it. So you've got all these disasters and things happening on in the world around you. That gets your attention, but there's other things that you need to give consideration to. This is just the beginning of sorrows. Then Jesus begins to talk about persecutions. In verses 9 and 10, they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. So you find that there's going to be persecutions. Now let me ask you, did the Christians face persecutions? Absolutely. The Bible records numerous persecutions. Go through the book of Acts, and incidentally, the book of Acts ends with Paul in prison, likely sometime in the early 60s AD. So you find persecutions going on even then as Paul is arrested. You could also look at letters from Paul in prison, probably likely in Rome about that time, where he writes to Philippi that's being persecuted. And you read of other letters of persecution. First Peter is written to saints who were facing tribulations in the world and so on. So you have numerous letters that actually were encouraging brethren as they were dealing with persecutions. You could also go over to Matthew 10 and that limited commission, where I think Jesus was looking toward the future and saying, you're going to be persecuted. You're going to be arrested and beaten and brought before rulers. And in Matthew 23, leading up to Jesus grieving over Jerusalem, he tells the disciples there that they were going to kill and crucify some of the wise men who were being sent. They would scourge some in their synagogues and persecute them from city to city. And on them the blood of all the prophets from Abel to Zechariah was going to fall on all of them. And again, read the book of Acts and you find these persecutions. So tribulations were taking place. You go on further, and in verse 11, it makes the point there, then many false prophets will arise up and deceive many. How often does the Bible warn about false prophets and false teachers? 2 Peter chapter 2, the first several verses there, warn explicitly about there were false prophets in times past. There will be false teachers in your midst. 1 John 4:1, probably a later letter. Test the spirits whether they are of God. And you could just go on and on with various letters that deal with false teachers and false prophets who are coming along. Second Peter and Jude both deal with these false prophets, as does 2 Thessalonians, where Paul talks about somebody rising who would be a false teacher and so on, and deal more with that as we deal with the Antichrist in a later lesson. We go on in our text in verse 24 or 12, and because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow old, but he who endures to the end will be saved. So you find there that Jesus says there are going to be many people that their love is going to grow cold. They're going to quit being faithful to God. They're going to be half-hearted and lukewarm in their service. You read about that in the book of Revelation, don't you? And isn't that typically the way that things go in the world? After a short period of time, you find that there's problems that brethren start to, the newness wears off, and they're not as fervent as they used to be. I think that's part of the concerns that the Hebrew writer has as he's writing against these things. So certainly this is a reality that Jesus says. The love of many is going to grow cold. Many professed believers are going to quit following, and some because of the persecutions. They're not going to be willing to endure whatever persecutions are there. But he who endures to the end will be saved. There's your lesson about endurance. A standard warning. Don't quit. The one that God is looking for is the one who won't give up, the one who will remain steadfast and faithful, even in difficult times. He who endures to the end will be saved is the promise that is there. And then that brings us to verse 24 or 14. And the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. Before the end comes, as he's talking about it, the gospel is going to be preached to all the world. And while premillennialists might say, well, see, that hasn't been fulfilled yet, I say the way that Jesus is using it, it is. For example, over in Colossians chapter 1 and in verse number 23, one of the things that Paul says in that particular text, he says there, if indeed you continue in the faith, there's your endurance to the end, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel, which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. It was basically preached to the whole world. You know, in the broader sense, mankind had opportunity to hear the word of God, and that's the point. The gospel is going to be preached everywhere. Jesus was saying that before the destruction of Jerusalem, the gospel is going to spread throughout the empire, and it did. Then the end will come, he says. Now, some here, they contend that this is the end of the world. And I'm going to tell you right now that some look at that verse there, that phrase, and they say that in AD 70, the world ended as far as the Bible is concerned. Everything was completed. It's a false doctrine called realized eschatology, or the AD 70 doctrine. And sometime next year, it is my plan to address that the way that I'm talking about premillennialism right now. I think we need to take a look at that particular doctrine and the danger that is associated with it. But premillennialists will look at this and say, well, see, this is talking about the end will coming. So obviously, when Jerusalem was destroyed, it wasn't the end. So this has to be talking about something that is yet in the future. But contextually, it would have to be about the end of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Remember, that's why we looked at that verse when we first began. We started with verse number 34. Remember, it's that generation. It's that generation that is being dealt with. And so the end that came, if it came during that generation, obviously it's not talking about the end of the world. And that's a point to give consideration to. Well, as we continue, we come to verse number 15 of our text. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So here we find the description of the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel. Now, in our last lesson dealing with the Great Tribulation, we looked at Daniel 9. And at the end of our lesson, dealing there with the 70 weeks prophecy, which we noted that that 70th week was completed in the first century. And I believe with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and we noted there in a text that it talked about, and I'm trying to get to Daniel chapter 9 and in verse number 27, where we read in that text where it talked about the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate. The Lord made desolate is the point. But you find that there's a couple of other texts in Daniel that probably are what Jesus is referring to. In Daniel 11 and in verse 31, Daniel 11 and in verse number 31, we read there in that text, and forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifice and place the abomination of desolation there. And again in chapter 12, one of the last verses, or the next to the last verse, that's what it actually talks about. There it talks about the abomination of desolation. And from a textual standpoint, likely what Daniel is talking about there is the defilement of the temple by a Greek general whose name was Antiochus Epiphanes. And he was somebody who basically outlawed Judaism. And he went into the city of Jerusalem and he breached the temple, and he actually defiled the temple and ordered the ending of sacrifices. And basically it is said that he offered a defiled sacrifice on the altar. Some say he offered pig's blood. And thus it was a horrible time for Israel. Lasted about 3.5 years for what it's worth. And so you have that taking place. And it's actually recorded in one of the apocryphal books. In 2 Maccabees, you have a little bit of history that's associated with that particular event there. So we find that Jesus is talking about that. But the question is, if he's mentioning that, why does he say that you're going to see the abomination of desolation that was spoken of by Daniel? And I think it's kind of interesting that he uses the word spoken of, not prophesied. in this particular case, even though it was a prophecy, Jesus is, I believe here he's using, he's using a historical event to describe what is going to happen to Jerusalem. And basically he's going to say in the same way. In other words, you're going to see the temple defiled. And that's going to be a sign for you to leave, is the point. I want you to understand that in place of this statement, in Luke 21, the account of Luke of this, Jesus uses the expression, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you know it's time to leave. And that's what you find taking place. As a matter of fact, following this, some things are said here. Now, there's an interesting observation to make in this. Because they're going to be told to leave, and you're going to see that here in a moment, this has to be referenced to something leading up to the actual destruction of Jerusalem. And there's actually 2 or 3 events that it could apply to that actually fit the category. Number 1, Josephus records that Jewish zealots, at some point around 67, 68, so you're talking 3.5 to 4 years before the destruction, they defiled the temple. They actually entered in and killed some of the priests, and they were revolting against the Jewish leaders because they didn't like where they stood. And there was a massacre in the temple. That could have been the desecration, abomination of desolation in the temple. There were some there that weren't supposed to be there. Also, if you study the history leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, for a few years they had been causing problems, and Rome was wanting to deal with Jerusalem. And history records at least 3 generals that were going to deal with Jerusalem. You have Gallus in AD 66, and he didn't finish the work. You have another one, Vespasian in 68, and then Titus in AD 70, who would finally destroy the temple. But what's interesting to note about that, and I just want to mention Vespasian as an example, because according to Josephus, Vespasian was preparing to surround Jerusalem. But Nero, Caesar, dies, and he basically, rather than actually surrounding the city, he basically retreats, at least for a while. And he goes to Rome because you've got upheaval in the kingdom, to determine what the future holds and what the new Caesar was going to want to take place where that was concerned. So he basically calls off the attack, and then 2 years later, Titus comes. Now let me ask you right now, if Jews know that Rome's about to surround the city, but they back off, you think that's a sign? You think that's a warning? You know what? Maybe I need to be concerned about this. And a Jew who loved the city of Jerusalem might not have done that. But Christians, on the other hand, well, let's see what Jesus says. Let's continue in our text. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 16. So you read there about the abomination of desolation, verse 16. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are on their housetops not go down to take anything out of the house. Let him who is in the field not go back to his clothes, or to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. So let's talk about these expressions. You have a bunch of them there. If you're in Judea, get out. If you flee to the mountains around Judea. If you're in the field, don't go into the city. Whoa, if you're pregnant, you better pray that you're not pregnant or nursing a baby, because it's going to be a whole lot more difficult for you to run and to get out of the city if that's the condition that you're in. Pray that it's not on the Sabbath. Jerusalem would lock their gates on the Sabbath so you couldn't get out. Or in the winter. Well, wintertime is more harsh. And so it would make it more difficult to escape. And so the request was, pray that it not be like this. Now here's a question that I have for you. If this is about the second coming of the Lord, him coming to rapture saints and all those types of things, or whatever's involved in that, Why would we be concerned about these matters? How is the coming of the Lord going to affect somebody that's not in Jerusalem if it's going to be worldwide? Think about that. Why would it matter if you're pregnant or if you're nursing a child or whether it's in the winter? Why would those things matter? The Lord's going to come back when he comes back, period. And his judgment is going to take place at that time. So even from a premillennialist standpoint, this doesn't make sense. And that's a challenge to give consideration to. But let's go on in our text for the sake of time. In verse number 21, we read there will be tribulation. There will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor will ever be. Now, here we have the great tribulation that is mentioned. And again, remember I said this is one of the key texts. Now, it's interesting, if you go over to Luke's account, Luke uses the expression, these are the days of vengeance. And the point that I'm making, when you've got that idea of vengeance, this is about a judgment. It's not about persecutions against Christians. If anything, it's a judgment from God. And this could describe the destruction of Jerusalem when it takes place. It is said that it was extremely horrible. And from a standpoint of Jewish history, there wasn't anything like it prior to this. That's the point. Josephus, again, in his War of the Jews, he records the horrors of what took place leading up to the actual breach of the walls, and as the soldiers went in through the city and destroyed everything. It is said that when Titus conquered the city, more than 1 million Jews were killed by the Romans. They just marched through the street, and anybody and everybody that they saw, they ran their swords to them, and they killed them. And prior to that, the city had been sieged, and there was a famine that was so severe that some sources say that women were eating their children, or that people were eating children, and so on. And it said that the soldiers, as they were going through the cities and as they went to raid the houses, which was typical of an army back then, they would go into some houses and they would find them filled with corpses. And the scene was so grotesque that they would just step out of the house without taking anything. That's how terrible it was. It said that there was so much bloodshed, and this is Josephus. Josephus said that there was so much bloodshed that as the blood flowed down the street, it put out some of the fires. That's how horrific the destruction of Jerusalem was. You think you could call that a great tribulation as far as the Jews were concerned? So there you have your great tribulation as it is associated with the destruction of Jerusalem. Now you continue to read in verse 22 where Jesus said, and unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. It's not going to last forever. That's the point. It's going to be swift. And I think the siege of Titus was about 6 months. I don't know what all happened prior to that leading up to it. But the fact that Jerusalem was destroyed, that gave relief to God's people. And that's the point. God protected those who belonged to him. And we continue to read following this. We read here, it says in verse 23, then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So Jesus is saying, again, you're going to have people who are going to stand up and they're going to make these prophecies. And they're going to claim to be the deliverers and so on. Don't believe them. They're not going to stop this from happening. They're even going to deceive some of the elect. Some who belong to God are going to be deceived and think that they are who they claim to be. Jesus says, don't believe them. The destruction is going to happen. And furthermore, he says, I've told you this beforehand. You're going to know that that's happening. You know, a great lesson to learn about somebody that knows what they're talking about is when they tell you beforehand what's going to happen. It's exactly what Jesus did and what you see in this particular text. Going all the way through verse number 26. See, I've told you these things. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out, and look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. So you find as the lightning comes from the east to the west, and the point is this is going to happen swiftly, and it's going to be powerful, and it's going to be destructive. And so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, some, when they see the expression coming of the Son of Man, they see end of the world. They see second coming. Well, certainly the second coming will be a coming of the Son of Man. But I want you to understand, if you've studied your Bible, and if you've studied Old Testament history, if you've studied the prophets, you know that expressions like the coming of the Son of Man or the day of the Lord is just descriptive of a day of judgment. And there are many days of judgment in Scripture. And friends, you get this marked down clearly. The destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 by Rome was a day of the Lord. It was a judgment from God, a powerful judgment, as this text described, but it wasn't the second coming. So keep that in mind, and it fits into that category of this particular description. And he goes on further, and he makes the point there, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds in heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of the trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four ends, from one end of heaven to the other. And what I want you to note here is when you've got the idea of the sun being darkened, stars falling, and those types of things, when you look at apocalyptic literature and the way Jesus is describing this, as recorded in Matthew chapter 24, it fits in the apocalyptic type of a genre, where he's describing things with figurative language, representative language. Typically, when you talk about stars and stars falling from heaven and the sun being darkened and those types of things, it's dealing with leaders. It's dealing with the leaders of nations. And I have listed here some examples. We don't have time to read them now. But in Isaiah 13, Babylon is described that way. Isaiah 51, a more general description of judgment of various peoples. Amos 8 even talks about Israel that way, being judged. So you have here the sun darkened, stars falling. It's a judgment from God is the point. And the idea of the sign of the Son of Man coming in the clouds, I think the point that is being made there, where Jesus talks about the earth is going to mourn, is the devastation of this city is going to be so great that the world is going to know that this was the hand of God. Especially when you consider the prophecies concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. The earth is going to mourn. So we find here, they're grieving. And of course, Jerusalem is cut off, and the world knows that God has turned against his people. And then you find deliverance for the saints as his elect are gathered from the four winds. Christians are going to be vindicated by this event, especially from the Jews who had persecuted Christians. And they might have been crying, how long? They're vindicated. And I think that's the point. You know, it has actually been said historically that in Jerusalem, when it was destroyed in AD 70, that no Christians perished in the city. They got out. Why? Read Matthew 24. If they were studying, they would have known what was about to take place, and they would have got out. And thus we find Jesus beginning in verse 32, where we read in that text, it says, "Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass till all these things take place." Jesus tells this short parable about a fig tree, and basically what it's about is, you know what? You know harvest time by looking at the leaves on a fig tree. Look at the fruit. You can tell when it's time for harvest. And Jesus says, in the same way that you can tell when it's time to pick the figs, so you can look at these signs that I've just told you about. And when you see those things, get out. Get out of the city. And that's the point of this text. And so if Christians were paying attention, they would have known to get out of the city. And they did. And friends, you tie all that together, you can see why this is about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now let's wrap this up by noticing in chapter 24 and in verse number 2, once again where we started. Jesus said, "Not a stone." He made a point. "Surely I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon another." It is said that after Jerusalem was destroyed, that Titus gave orders to demolish the city, to tear it down, and to destroy the temple, to disassemble the temple, and they did. And the destruction was so complete that not a single stone stood on top of another on the temple complex. The ground was plowed and the city was a heap of ruins. And you know, even to this day, you find rubble that dates back to the first century. And so you find very much the prophecy that Jesus made and described exactly what was going to happen. That is exactly what took place when Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. So there you have Matthew 24. Does that sound like it's talking about something in the future? Clearly, it's about the destruction of Jerusalem, not the future return of Jesus. Incidentally, Matthew 24, 36 and through the rest of the chapter, this could be about the Lord's return. But when you read it, if it is about the Lord's future return, one of the things that it describes is that you don't know when it's going to happen. And see, that's what makes me lean toward that's talking about the Lord's return. Jesus had just got done with this long, detailed description of what was going to happen in Jerusalem and how they were going to know. And then he says, but of that day and hour, no one knows. I'm going to tell you right now, that ought to get our attention. Because we do not know when our Lord is going to return, we better be ready now. To plug Matthew 24 into a future timeline of a physical kingdom on earth, it requires the twisting of the text and great imagination. But that's what the doctrine of premillennialism is. And that's what it does. And that's why it is my conviction that premillennialism is something that ought to be repudiated and rejected by Christians. What about you? You know, the fact is the Lord is going to return. Are you ready for his return? And is there something that we can do to help you with that? So with that, I commend this lesson to you to think about these things. So if you would, please bow with me at this time. Our dear God and our Heavenly Father, we once again come to you. We are so thankful for the abundance of blessings that you have provided for us. We are thankful for your word that you have provided for us, which is designed to give us encouragement, to guide us through our lives, to instruct us so that we can live in a way that is pleasing to you, and so that we can prepare for your return, knowing that when you return, we have a hope of heaven if we have faithfully served you throughout this life. Help us, dear God, to with good and honest hearts consider all of your word, apply it to our lives, and look to share it with others. Guide us through this day. Guide us through the remainder of this week. Help us in all that we do to keep you in our thoughts and in our minds, and help us to let our light shine before others, looking toward that day when we can spend eternity with you. We ask all this in Jesus' name, and amen. So again, I want to thank each and every one of you for listening to this lesson. Hopefully, as always, there's some benefit in here, some things for you to give consideration to. And if you have questions about something that I have said, leave them in the comments below or email me, and I will do my best to get back with you concerning that. In the meantime, have a good day and a good week.